All right, thanks, April. Okay, I'm Jessie Patella-Ray. I am moderating this panel. I have a academic background in philosophy and women and gender studies, and worked particularly on embodiment, female embodiment, and pregnancy and childbirth. Actually, it was my specialty. So I'm interested in embodiment, and we have three panelists who are going to talk about that from various angles. The first one is it's our baby. The first one is Ada Cable. She is a trans woman academic, activist, and artist working on power, labor, and gender through a variety of mediums. She writes in various modes, produces activist artworks, and care communities of trans women. Despite her handle, she doesn't have a PhD. She doesn't want you to be confused. Actually, I think I'll just go through but you can come up, but I will give the other two introductions so that we can do all three papers, and then after the three papers, we will do questions. All right, so the second panelist is Gabi Shafson. He is a recovering capitalist who's currently pursuing a PhD in art practice at UC San Diego. And he's also a regular contributor to Cyborgology. And then the last presentation that we're going to have is MD Nobel, and he is pursuing a PhD in media and communication studies at University of Gothenburg, and his interests lie in the field of youth, deviance, and online culture. His present doctoral project is on cybersexual harassment culture and victim resistance. He's attended programs in journalism, media studies, criminology, and youth studies. And in his past life, he was a journalist and a screenwriter. Okay, so we are going to start with Ada.
Hi, have we got slides? Video makes it to slides. Running.
It's extended right now, so.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. We are good at internet honest. Okay. Ooh, we have slides. Hi. So I'm Ado. Again, not a doctor, art and activist. I guess I'm kind of an academic by association more than anything else. I keep on going to conferences, and then, yeah, and I'm also doing a master's. I'd like to apologise for the state of my slides. PowerPoint has decided to repair them. So I have no idea what's coming right now. Right, let's get our notes up. So I'm talking about trauma, disposability, abuse and care. So we need content notes for like all of that. Could we have, hi. I'm talking about trauma, disposability, abuse and care. They're kind of everywhere in the presentation. I can't really content note specifically for them, but I'll also be using specific content notes for some mentions of suicide later on in the presentation. This is like, I'm going to talk about some things which trans women talk about among ourselves: trauma, transmisogyny, care, and placing it in a context of materialist feminism. So like Federici mixed up with Porpentine, who's a trans woman, and like I'm kind of handling it. I think this, I'm forgetting when I change slides on here. I don't change slides on there. So I think this is going to be a good place to start. I'm going to be quoting a lot from this essay, which is Porpentine's Hot Allostatic Load, because, well, Porpentine was kind enough to take me down most of the way down this line of thinking, and it perfectly encapsulates how disposability and transmisogyny play into each other, and create wounded bodies, or if we're going with Haraway, or Porpentine would say trans bodies, trash bodies, which I'm going to argue are optimised for certain kinds of domestic labour. Porpentine is at Slimedaughter on Twitter. Her essay is in the New Inquiry. And her work's in the Whitney at the moment, so go and see it if you have a chance, because like there's a trans woman in an actual gallery. That doesn't really happen. So now we get to the fun theory stuff. How does transmisogyny act to create labouring bodies? One of the central messages of Serrano's 2007 Whipping Girl is that trans misogyny is about denying and punishing femininity and how it creates a drive to be a real woman. But this isn't a Serrano quote. This is Federici talking in 1975 about how womanhood is offered as a gift to by patriarchy to reward housework, to encourage housework, to extract labour from us. The real woman is a prize held for performing femininity and or labour, and they're both the same thing as far as me and Federici are concerned. Transmisogyny then parallels strongly misogyny, a tool for extracting labour from a specific kind of woman. While I'm talking about parallels, it's important to note that while the prize of womanhood is never fully bestowed by patriarchy, certainly not to trans women, and it's never permanently bestowed, it's doubly denied to groups like black women, disabled women, queer women, and others. It's still a tool of doubly extracting labour on top of those. I said I'd be using a lot of Porpentine earlier, and I'm not kidding when I say that her work is central. While there's a lot of writing about the embodied effect of trauma, Porpentine brings it all together to talk about how transmisogyny, abuse and disposability interplay to force trans women to perform gender, labour and sexuality for the benefit of non-trans women. She identifies mechanisms within the queer scene designed for accountability and how they're used as threats to keep trans people in line, and when these mechanisms are inevitably deployed against trans women, they cause a deep and embodied trauma. At the core of this is the transmisogyny that allows the disposability to happen. All trans femmes are precast as rapists, paedophiles and violent men invading your toilet. So when womanhood is offered, you take it and you play the part, do the labour, otherwise you're disposed of. Going through this process, being subject to the eternal surveillance for cracks in your femininity, and when it eventually does crack, the disposability that comes next is a deeply embodied process. An already disrupted endocrine system gets further damaged, anxiety, PTSD and chronic fatigue set in. Like most trauma-surviving populations, trans women have massively elevated incidence of chronic fatigue syndrome. Processes that make a body weak, timid, afraid to engage with productive labour of queer communities, and that's a description of exactly how patriarchy sees women. We're weak, we're timid, we hide in the corner, and that's the body which is created by transmisogynistic trauma. It acts on our body as surely as hormones or surgery to mould our bodies into exactly what patriarchy would want us to be. Hot allostatic loads deals quite specifically with the trauma of abuse of queer communities, but there's other ways our trauma is used to feminise our bodies, to make them into perfect labouring machines for a patriarchy. I'm going to be talking about suicide for a bit. Trans communities quite simply have a terrifying suicide rate. Everyone knows someone who's died, and the longer you spend time in our community, the more and more of your friends die. Or you do. So trans communities spend massive amounts of time making sure our friends don't die. We're taught by our dead friends that if we don't do the care, bad things will happen. The background caring function is then deeply stuck inside the body. Noises of distress become triggers, and even mild distress begins to trigger you. You have a deep gut reaction to all of this, and it becomes undirected. Trauma doesn't make great things for caring very specifically about the determination of who needs care. If a man needs care, if a cis woman needs care, the trauma still kicks in. You still have this reaction which forces you to do this. Trauma is, as such, perfect for the extraction of labour from trans women onto other groups. The acts of punishment meted out not for performing femininity become, as we saw above, a mechanism for conditioning our bodies to do care for those imparting the violence. I think it's important to note that this positions trans women in a place where building is restricted by constant maintenance. Just as domestic labour keeps women out of the workforce, prohibits building our own institutions, so does caring labour for transmisogyny, keeping us constantly dashing around fixing fires in the queer community. And at the same time, the fires we fix for people who cry on our shoulders then go back to work and are essential for building the institutions that traumatise us in turn. And then there's one very important mechanism which I haven't dealt with yet, and that's sex work. And I like to preface this with, sex work is not evil, and identifying how the phenomena of trans sex work is intertwined with trauma does not mean I'm suggesting that people are forced into it, traumatised into it. I don't want to put into those narratives. I'm not saying that about care work either, for record. I'm identifying how a phenomenon goes on. I'm not passing a judgment on it or suggesting a care strike. A care strike would kill hundreds of trans women. Don't do that shit. So the traumatized bodies I described above are optimized by capital, not just for care work, but in parallel with the eroticization and monstrosity of our bodies that comes with transmisogyny. It's intensely useful for sex work, because sex work is, after all, a form of productive emotional labour, or at least waged reproductive labour, in which mostly, though not all, men need someone who's practiced at listening, doing the work of pleasing them. Traumatised bodies are optimised for this work, and just because it's getting paid, it doesn't mean the systems of violence that produce traumatised bodies for domestic labour aren't also formed for the purpose of producing sex working bodies. So, like, I think the trauma imparted by transmisogyny at the end of this acts as a social anti-androgen. Anti-androgens are a drug that's part of our hormone treatment that counters the effect of testosterone. Taken alone, they result in weakened energy, weakened muscles, and a generally softer body. That's exactly what transmisogynistic trauma is constructed to do. Produce a body that has a violent reaction not just to doing care, but that's unable to resist the onus of care placed upon them. In other words, trauma produces what capital sees as a woman's body, and I'd like to note that trauma also enacts this way in cis women, except it enacts it through different mechanisms. In other words, and the body we're trying to and if the body were trying to resist this, there's another helping of violence waiting for it, and they will keep hitting you until you are dead or doing the work. So, wrapping this up. Trans femmes are placed in abusive and traumatising environments, and it's demanded that they perform femininity, which is analogous to domestic labour for, well, anyone with a materialist analysis. Effective labour for both the non-trans femme residents of the space and their trans women friends who are always afraid of dying. This trauma is deeply embodied, resulting in statistical increase in CFS in the trans population, anxiety, PTSD, and other embodied responses. These responses are, not coincidentally, the bodies that are optimised for performing reproductive and sexual labour, or producing bodies that maintain capital's perfect idea of womanhood. The responses constitute a social phenomenon that produces an embodied change in trans women and coincides with forming us into a vision of a woman that capital has, although not necessarily the cultural vision of womanhood or our own vision of womanhood. Thanks, I guess. I'm sorry about the mess that was my slides. And Dr. Cable on Twitter with a 1 in place of an L. Say hi, send me questions, and support Porpentine. Go to the Whitney, go to slimedaughter.com, buy her stuff. Go.
I have large type versions of my presentation if anybody would want some. Okay, so I was in this room yesterday and I couldn't see like the bottom half of every slide, so I kind of pushed everything up and then I put it on this morning and realized that that light is just negating half of the other half of the slide. So we'll do our best here. That's not going to work. All right. Also, in the program, it notes that I worked on this with my colleague Zach Kaiser. He's on the live stream right now, so can everyone just say, "Hey, Zach"? Hey, Zach. All right. We'll assume he sees that in about 12 minutes. All right. So, okay, let's do this. This is the Pavel Norway Dream Machine. It was built by myself, Zachary Kaiser, and also Sophie Hodara, and is inspired by the work of Dr. Pavel Norway, a visionary, if misguided doctor from the mid-19th century London, and attempts to recreate his experiments using modern technologies, specifically those of the quantified self. Per Deborah Lupton, the term quantified self overtly refers to using numbers as a means of monitoring and measuring elements of everyday life and embodiment, allowing individuals to engage in self-tracking and analysis through the collection of data about everyday activities, for example, walking and sleeping, as well as other data such as your DNA. Contemporary popular culture's foray into the quantified self as movement is often credited as an informal meeting of 28 individuals at the home of Kevin Kelly. Kelly, a noted neoliberal technologist, was also founding editor of Wired magazine and author of 1999's The New Rules for the New Economy. It is no surprise, then, that so much of the quantified self discourse represents neoliberal tenets. Fitbit's assertion that you find your fit, or that only Fitbit gives you the freedom to get fit your way. But let's go back for a second to the 19th century. If my slides will do so. Dr. Norway's brief 1841 treatise, Computable Transformation of Human Qualities to Those of a Visible Dream Memory, is an obscure but intriguing thesis on the possibility of inferring dream content from the behavior of a subject after he or she has awakened. Developed over 100 years before the discovery of REM sleep, computable transformation argues that human bodies produce residual energy, a type of corpuscular molecule that emits all day. He believed that this energy could be collected and measured, including its velocity, coming off the body, temperature, etc., which would make it possible to reconstruct the prior dreams. In our hybrid transmedia performance exhibition, we introduce our subject to Pavel Norway briefly before we then ask them to sit on our examination table. We attach a Fitbit, EEG, and muscle sensor to their bodies, we ask them a few questions about their sleep habits, and then we ask them to relax. Generally speaking, quantified self devices collect information, be it via a chip that measures movement or sensors that measure electrical current and outputs computer-readable data, and that is ones and zeros, right? So for instance, here is not a day's worth of Fitbit data that I intercepted between my Bluetooth device and my laptop. Let's see if it's on the next slide. Nope. Great. If you wanted to, and I did want to, you could turn this data into another type of file on a computer. But let's be perfectly honest. You understand this black space as much as you would understand the hex data that you would be seeing on the screen, unless you are superhuman in some sort of way, which is another panel altogether. So here is 1 month of wearing and downloading data from the Fitbit. I have over 70,000 bytes, which I was able to build an image with. It's 88 by 268 pixels. And so the hex data represented in these 23,584 pixels are no more concrete or abstract than the values which I had intercepted from the Fitbit. They are, in fact, the same exact values. So each color is made up of 3 bytes of Fitbit data, which I intercepted between the Bluetooth thing from my wrist and my computer. And then when you put it into an image, those become colors. There it is, the hex data. All right. Where should we go? Should we go to page 3? Referring back to the dream machine, using live data from our subject, we are able to, within seconds, produce what we put forward as a representation of their most recent dream state. In this case, we wrote an algorithm to convert our data into search queries for the Vine API, as well as into audio files. I'm going to play a video. We'll see if the volume is either too loud or too low, because it won't be in between. And so what you see here and what you hear is our subject, Erin, had her data collected, and then we're feeding it through a Max MSP patch. And you can't see the visuals, but there are some. If you go to my website, this video is much clearer, and you're hearing sort of a sonification of that data as well. So the connection between Dr. Norway's work and the contemporary QS movement is strong, right? Both seek to infer a macro-level understanding of a body by measuring its micro qualities. Dr. Norway never fully implemented his theories, though he did produce a number of etchings which sought to translate collected data points into visualizations. So he would collect this data off the subject, he would get high on opium, and then he would start sketching. In our project, we draw a correlation between the absurdity and pseudoscience of contemporary QS technologies and Dr. Norway's work. We employ the story of Dr. Norway as a fable of sorts, a rhetorical device intended to operate as a cautionary tale. Per Lupton again, the QS movement is an ethos and apparatus of practices that has gathered momentum in today's world of sensor-laden wearable devices. It privileges a purely quantitative understanding of the world, eliminating from a consideration of existence those aspects of life that cannot be quantified or that companies choose not to quantify. We argue that this rationalist proposition is absurd, reductive, and ultimately dangerous for the human condition. The Pavel Norway Dream Machine aims to underscore the absurdity of the QS movement as well as the pseudoscience of many of the technologies its adherents use. Why, you might ask, am I doing this? Well, my diagnosis came from a doctor at Massachusetts General Hospital in August of 2010. She asked about my family and my love life. She pinched my skin and prodded my scars. She took copious notes, and then she wrote up a thorough report with her verdict: Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, a genetic collagen deficiency. The diagnosis was no real surprise. My sister, who's 12 years older, was diagnosed by the same doctor a year or so earlier, and Ellie's EDS had progressed beyond my condition at the time. Her chronic joint pain, stretchy skin, and immunodeficiency were much more pronounced and took a more significant toll on her daily life than on mine. Dr. Lin, however, could not have been more pleased with her findings because, as a geneticist, she had siblings present with similar symptoms at varying stages of severity, and that was like a goldmine of study fodder for her. Until August of 2010, Ehlers-Danlos looked like this: day-long or more pain after particularly strenuous exercise, and scars that look like cigarette paper, showing off veins that bulge despite my non-muscular stature, skin that stretches further off my muscles than most. To be fair, I felt exactly that way when I was going through this stuff, and still do. Limbs that bend awkwardly. A few weeks after my 18th birthday, my lung collapsed spontaneously. Later that year, I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis, the kind of gastrointestinally based immunodeficiency often associated with EDS. For the years before and nearly a decade after, I had simply considered myself an unlucky but relatively typical Ashkenazi Jew. In fact, I was often told, yeah, that sort of thing happens to skinny white Jewish boys. But now, there was a name for all this. There was a doctor's report, a WebMD entry. Most importantly, there was certainty that something in my DNA was not quite normal. In The Taming of Chance, Ian Hacking dedicates an entire chapter to the word normal. He notes the word's etymological roots in geometry. It meant perpendicular, at right angles, orthogonal. Orthodontists make your teeth right. Orthopedists make your bones and muscles right. Critically, however, he points to sort of the magical nature of the word. He says one can use the word to say how things are, but also to say how things ought to be. Look, after all, at the normal distribution on the familiar bell curve. Collections of data points, they sort of, on a single metric, fall into this predictable pattern that just looks like a big lump, and we stick a pole in the middle, and we call that average. In 1889, Francis Galton, father of eugenics and all-around bag of dicks, wrote about his love for the normal distribution. I was hoping that one would land well. Specifically, he was excited about how the normal distribution let him make sweeping generalizations about large populations based on a few bodily measurements. Of course, these generalizations were by no means innocuous. He argued that the human race could be moved further and further to the right of the bell curve, that is, to the exceptional, by simply breeding out the ones on the left, that is, the deficient. His argument was for forced sterilization and selective breeding. Some of his most enthusiastic followers were a bit more aggressive in their attempts to cleanse the human race. And I hope you don't think I'm trying to sanitize Nazism. I think I'm just sick of seeing pictures of swastikas. But, Gabi, you ask, you're not actually about to suggest that the quantified self and the Nazis have a lot in common, are you? You may also ask if that cat is eating that Fitbit, and the answer is yes. To the second question, not the first one. If all has gone as planned, I've got about 6.5 minutes left on this presentation, but I'm cracking too many jokes. But that means that I have around, and now I lost my place because of that joke. I actually do have a really good, strong genealogical relationship between eugenics and the quantified self, a relationship that runs along technologies of governmentality, as elucidated by Michel Foucault in his 1978 talks to the Collège de France. And if you're playing Theorizing the Web Bingo and you have the Michel Foucault square, you're welcome. Or I could tell you that I'm going to actually make that exact argument on the Cyborgology blog over the coming weeks, and that you should check that out. And then I could compare the way the quantified self works to the ideas of philosopher Elaine Scarry from her 1985 The Body in Pain. In the book, she explores the relationships between the torturer and the tortured to explore the relationship between the feeling and the expression of pain. She suggests that when the sentient facts of a person's suffering manifest in the visible world, that is, when subjects scream, bleed, or otherwise convey their suffering, the torturer has successfully objectified his subject's body, and he is now in control. Scary's torturers, be they actual pain-inflicting individuals or metaphorically arbiters of a central ideology or cultural construct, the torturers translate the intangible into the tangible, forcing its reconstruction in the sheer material factualness of the human body, borrowed to lend that cultural construct the aura of realness and certainty. And so this is how the quantified self works, as it offers a sheer material factualness of our normal or abnormal bodies. Famously, and like perfectly, Galton and Charles Darwin were first cousins. And if we go back to The Taming of Chance, Galton's 1877 speech to the Royal Institution in London is actually used by Hacking as an epigraph to a chapter entitled The Autonomy of Statistical Law. And here, Galton discusses normal distributions in relation to Darwin's evolution. He speaks of the ordinary genealogical course of race and how outliers die away at the margins, the scanty remnants of all exceptional members revert to mediocrity. Statistical laws, Galton says, show us that natural selection does not act by carving out each new generation according to a definite pattern on a Procrustean bed, irrespective of waste. They also explain how small a contribution is made to future generations by those who deviate widely from the mean, either in excess or deficiency, and they enable us to discover the precise sources when the deficiencies in the produce of exceptional types are supplied and their relative contributions. Hacking begins this chapter with this passage in order to illustrate, as he writes, that statistical laws have become autonomous when they could be used not only for the prediction of phenomena, but also for their explanation. So if natural selection expects a regression to the mean, or in the parlance of Francis Galton, a reversion to mediocrity, then the exceptional must be jettisoned. Normalization as survival of the fittest, one of neoliberalism's most important ideologies. Pain, on the other hand, is exceptional. Chronic illness is an outlier. These are conditions that resist the mean and, as such, resist expression in systems where regression is favored. Whatever pain achieves, writes Elaine Scary, it achieves in part through its unshareability, and it ensures this unshareability through its resistance to language. The standard off-the-shelf Fitbit has no language to express a condition such as Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. It becomes the role of the diagnosed to find a means to express their situation. The communications philosopher James Carey, who Jay Rosen mentioned last night on the big stage, he notes that things can become so familiar that we no longer perceive them at all. Art, however, can take the texture of a fabric, the design of a face, and wrench these ordinary phenomena out of the backdrop of existence and force them into the foreground of consideration. And you notice I read this like my first year of my MFA, which was many years ago, and I was so excited. I gave a big star and an exclamation point. Carey's position here drives the work of my project, as I, the artist, seek to reframe the otherwise mundane data being collected about my quantified self into a means to raise questions about power, meaning, and identity not found in many other QS-related discourse. The importance of discourse, and even resistance around and to the quantified self movement, needs to be rooted in the dangers of normalization. Resistance to the tide upon which movements like QS are riding is a complicated goal, but that is the goal. The Pavel Norway Dream Machine and my raw data images are parts of an interrogation. They argue for a view of the quantified self movement as indicative of a computationally mediated culture which is, despite endless rhetoric to the contrary, jettisoning the non-normal. And we're quickly learning the power of that jettisoning. We see a movement predicated on violent normativity working from one of the most important offices in this country. Whereas the neoliberal project, of which the quantified self is a critical piece, is the empowerment of the individual through the exploitation of the collective, I believe in the responsibility of artists and scholars to empower the collective through the education of the individual. Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk here. This is really wonderful to be here in this city and in this vibrating conference for the second time this year. And I'm really delighted to be here. So today I'm going to talk about how and what news is constructing about revenge porn and how it is constructed. And we can see there are different types of news coming up in today's media. Sometimes it can be about countries taking actions against revenge porn, enacting laws, and sometimes it's about tech corporations, what kind of policies they are taking to support the victims. And also it can be a sheer human interest story when it is about a victim, her sufferings. And also we see media creating constructing the magnitude of the problem. So we can see that it's obviously media is playing a crucial role in constructing our knowledge about this particular phenomenon. But we also have to be critical about this knowledge construction, because when it is made available through use of language, then we have to think that if it is a discursive construction, then it is not neutral. And it can constitute and regulate subjectivities, different identities, and then it can favor one over the other within a particular social context. So that's why I'm interested to know what knowledge is constructed in media, in news media, about revenge porn and how it is constructed. So before I present my own study, I would like to give you some idea about what existing literatures are talking about this particular topic. We can see there's a tendency of blaming the media, blaming the victims in news. And why is that? Because in general in the society, it is considered the production and the exchange of these contents are done for mutual pleasure. And if there is any harmful consequence or suffering, then it is thought to be a natural consequence. And also the focus is on the victim, what he or she has done or hasn't that led to their suffering or abuse. And it is also we blame the victims, but not the offender who is committing this kind of crime. And also there is another tendency of media to disregard the magnitude of this problem, because if we compare this with intimate partner violence, then we see that there's a similarity also, like it is not taken seriously, or it is only viewed as a misdemeanor, not a felony. And since the victim has the misfortune to know her perpetrator, so it is only thought to be their isolated problem, only a victim-centered problem, not a universal problem in society. And particularly, I can give you one example from a recent study by Fairbairn in 2015, and his sample articles were failing to adequately capture the ordeal of the victims. Now, there is a problem here. I'm not saying that it's not the women who are being victims, but if we repeatedly talk about female victimization, then it can also strengthen gender stereotypes. Men are playing the role of a predator and the female victims are falling prey. So there can be a sense of victimization affecting their normal sexual behavior online. But this is a particular strategy taken by media because that relies on our established knowledge about a phenomenon, what kind of problem orientation we have about this subject. So mass media try to relay that. And also, it can be taken positively. When it is about a new social problem, then media tries to frame the victims in order to gain institutional support or legal reformation. But both these kind of criticisms are, in my view, ignoring one recent development in the media landscape, which is inclusion and integration of content created by bloggers, activists, or even advocacy agencies. And according to Minich, this is a pro-feminist journalism taking place, because now we see that there are separate sections in most of the news outlets that deals with issues of women's problems and what kind of solutions there should be in terms of legal reformation. So I see there is a possibility to accommodate competing and contrasting discourses within the broader media discourse. So my present study is about thematic analysis of 99 news stories. I couldn't make it round figure, but I have collected them, which were published over a period of 5 years, from 2012 to 2016. And these were published in New York Times, Fox News, NBC News, and CNN. And I have found 3 major themes emerging from the data. So we can see there's a kind of definition in news media. They just don't only report about the phenomenon, but they give us what is revenge porn. It's interesting that they still call it revenge porn, but I don't see any revenge taking place using porn. But it's like it shouldn't be called porn. Of course, we have to think about what other actors are involved here. There are money-making schemes by the website operators. There are hackers involved here. So it shouldn't be only called revenge porn, but we maybe need to think another time, and we maybe redefine it. So I have presented here 3 examples. Here you see that media is giving us the background, what leads to such actions, and sometimes it's just about definition. I think it's has become a bit clumsy because maybe some of you cannot see the end of this slide. But here we see that the offline damages it can cause, that sometimes it's about extortion, it can be blackmail, and sometimes in worst case, it can be about abetment to suicide. So here I'm being a bit descriptive. These are my thematic categories. Here you can see in significant number of articles, women were presented as the victim, and news media tries to depict it as a female victimization. And the characterization of these victims, like they're naive and they're unsuspecting, so they cannot be blamed for their actions. And we also see repeated mentioning of ensuing damages, reports describing what kind of consequences they face in their both online and offline life. Yes, and news also does advocacy. They provide the victims with information, where they can go, what kind of legal assistance they can get from different institutions. So this is the first thematic category, first theme, which is, the revenge porn is constructed in news within a gendered frame. It recognizes this problem as a non-consensual sharing and distribution of intimate images, but it is only presented as a victimization of women. And they give the social groups they belong to, these women, for example, wives, girlfriends, maybe ex-partner, teachers, professionals. And like I said, the characterization of these women as naive and unsuspecting. And these actions are carried out by men, their former partners, boyfriends, even hackers. And they have a malicious intention to, sexually shame them and making profit, damaging reputation. And yes, on the one hand, we have victims in need of institutional support. On the other hand, we have offenders who needs criminal punishment. So there is a gender binary here. Now, my second theme is the revenge porn is being criminalized in news. You can see three different types of categories, if I can put them in groups. One is revenge porn is framed as a crime or to be a crime, and more and more states are going to criminalize revenge porn. And then we have a deterrent effect in news that it mentions about investigating authorities, what charges can be brought against the offenders, and the punishment or penalties they will face. And then news also goes to investigate in depth and report about the other actors who are involved in this. For example, the third-party content distributors, the website operators, and if they should have the criminal liability. Because previously they had a legal impunity, these website operators, but now we can see there are laws that we can try the website operators as well, and some of such website operators have been in jail by now. So if I analyze that those categories, then we can see that revenge porn is framed as a crime. It has a deterrent effect, and it goes in depth with investigation of involvement of other actors and their criminal liabilities. And the third theme is about critiquing existing laws and policies against revenge porn. Of course, news media criticizes existing laws, the deficiencies we have in legal institutions across the globe. But at the same time, it also provides an alternative discourse that if it should conflict against against people's right to freely express themselves, or free speech right, which is given by the First Amendment. And news media has its stake there, because whenever it is a politician doing these kind of actions, then media scandalize their whole incidents, and then it becomes a big news. Then and also about celebrities, they provide information, they provide their pictures. Then it's not about harassing anyone, but it's about for the benefit of broader population, we need to criticize the politicians. So news media brings their scandals in front of us. Yeah. I'll just be finishing. And also another thing is reporting about tech corporations' policies on revenge porn. And this is a very recent change that now the discourse of responsibility is shifting from the self towards other institutions, not only the legal institutions, but also the corporations who are making money by publishing content. So I'll just conclude here, and we can see the focus is also on the offenders and the other actors like website operators, not only the victims. So we can't really say that it's always about framing the victims, but it's also about other actors, particularly the offenders. And also news media is making this agenda to define it as a crime, and not only mere victim blaming. And we also have seen that the responsibility to protect self is being challenged and negotiated by increasing demand of legal reformations or supportive policies by the tech corporations. So that's it. Thank you for listening.
I realized at the outset that I forgot to tell you that Ashley won't be able to make it today, so we are one talk short. So I would like to open things up now for questions. Yes, I had a question for, tell me your name again, I'm sorry.
Nabil.
Nabil?
Yeah.
Okay. So you were saying that you felt like revenge porn shouldn't be categorized as porn. So then, what would you say it should be categorized? Like, what do you think is going on there?
Yes, I think it's a non-consensual sharing and distribution of intimate images, but then you need to define it as online harassment, not as a revenge porn. It doesn't give us the proper sense. It can be called non-consensual distribution of sexualized images, not porn, not revenge.
Right.
Doesn't that act to hide, like, obviously a lot of porn is produced in very ethical ways, but doesn't that act, it is certainly consumed in a pornographic manner, it's consumed in a very similar way. Many of its patterns of production and distribution and consumption are similar. And are you going to suggest that porn must be consensual for you to call it porn? And if so, does this not act to just hide the fact that lots of material which is used pornographically and produced for pornographic purposes is produced in a highly violent manner, as you identified?
I think just because it is consumed and used as for pornographic purposes, that doesn't make it a porn, because it is more about the consent. This is very important. If it is not consented, then if we call it porn, then we are like being we are talking in their terms who are doing it, not from a neutral position. So
How do you define porn then?
Me?
Yeah.
It can be sexualized content used for people's satisfaction in a different way, sexual satisfaction or gratification. But here in this case, we need to think about the harassment, the magnitude of the harassment. So that is more important than a bunch of people are having gratification of this content. It's not so important, but maybe we have to think more about the people who are suffering because of this. So we have to redefine it.
So, content notes CSA. We have a very traditional way of talking about violent pornography, and there's a massive tradition of understanding pornography produced of children who cannot consent as pornographic material. And there's a tradition of feminist scholarship which I have significant and massive problems with significant parts of it, which is designed to understand the violence of some kinds of pornography. And there's efforts led by sex workers to do the same thing. And we're not speaking from a neutral position here, we're speaking as the people who produce it, as survivors of sexual abuse, and I don't see why you're seeming to stand on top of these people who aren't speaking from a neutral position and taking your neutral position and putting it over us.
No, I'm not putting it over anyone. I just given my opinion. That's what asked to me, that what I think about it, and I just said about what I think. I'm not going to put anything on anyone. Yeah.
All right. Yes.
I had a question for Zach.
Gabi.
I'm
We're like,
sorry. My apologies.
ask our friends, we're the same person.
So I thought it was important. So the Quantify itself has been taken up in education quite a bit. So I go in and I work with teachers, and they're always wanting to, how can we use this data in my science class, or my math class? And I'm wondering, I really liked your end then here, where you said, we need to educate about this. We need to take a critical perspective. So you had that slide which connected Galton to Darwin, which is his cousin. But if you actually go in the reverse, Darwin's grandfather was one of the most prominent abolitionists of his time. And there's a pretty strong case that Darwin was fighting the polygenesis to say that we all came from one spot. So you could say that natural selection, Darwinian theory could be used for social justice, just as the DNA Innocence Project has been used for social justice. So what can I tell these teachers who want to bring in this quantified self into their classroom that would allow for a critical perspective to be taken, but also use the data in a way for to help us understand the world in a more socially equitable or socially just way.
Okay, so for the live stream, the question was how can something that I'm sort of painting in quite a nefarious, way be used for good, effectively? I mean, like, yeah? Specifically in education and for social justice, sure. Well, first of all, that Darwin was trying to say we're all come from the same place seems like erasure in a lot of ways, and it's actually utilized by eugenicists to say, like, look, we all come from the same place, and look where we ended up. You should be doing what we do, the white people. But that's not your question. Yeah, I mean, look, I love, the Melvin Kranzenberg, right? Technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. This is my argument is about systems of technology and the way that power works within them, right? And so, yes, is there a way to use data and quantified content for social justice? Absolutely, right? I mean, absolutely. You could absolutely look at a lot of very heavily quantified narratives on prison or crime, right? And use that for social justice for sure. What I'm trying to do as an artist and a scholar is to empower, again, like what I said at the end there was about empowering the collective through the education of the individual, as opposed to sort of convincing each individual that they can be exceptional, and the only way to do so is by, sort of jettisoning the deficient. So, I don't know, this is hard. A car can drive me to the airport or the hospital. A car can also hit me and kill me, right? So I'm not going to say don't do cars. I'm not going to say, like, don't go, well, I will say don't go and buy a Fitbit. That'd be awful. But I'm not trying to pass that sort of judgment. Sorry, I guess I'm rambling at this point. My answer is, yeah, it could totally be used in that context. I would hope, however, that the educators using it would be well informed on sort of the cultural and systemic issues of power within them. Is that fair?
Towards like open source type of quantified.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I didn't say at the beginning here is that I'm going to talk about corporate devices, corporate marketed devices, but I don't know that there is that big of a difference than like self-trackers who count their steps on their own, using like Benjamin Franklin supposedly, right, poked holes in a piece of paper for however many good things he did in a day. Like, it's the same thing. It's the same story. But individuals are doing that. Open source quantified itself, again, is being driven by like this idea that if we quantify, we will be better. If we turn into numbers, we are true and we are understood. And so that, again, another panel.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm sorry I missed the first part of this, so this is for you, and if you covered it, sorry about that.
I'll probably say yes either way.
I was wondering if in your research making this distinction between people who choose to self-track and those who must do it for medical reasons, and what the outcomes of that might be, and what if you take into account the kind of I guess perceptual changes that come about through being compelled to self-track.
Excellent question about individuals who choose to self-track or those who are compelled to do so for purposes of care. There's a project coming out of Children's Hospital in Cincinnati called the C3N Network, Collaborative Chronic Care Network, and they are trying to create what they call N of 1. Trying to enact N of 1 studies among patients with actually Crohn's and colitis as well as chronic pain, and they're using a lot of self-tracking technologies. First of all, I'd like to really spend a lot of time looking at that project. It's actually something I'm going to try to pitch for next academic year. But I think that we've got a lot of questions about pathological and normal, about how, maybe the world is not that great for people in pain because it's built for people not in pain. Maybe the world considers, individuals as abnormal when There's no such thing, right? So yeah, I think it's a really, really good question, and I don't by any means have a good answer for it, except to say it's something we should totally talk about. Why are these projects being compelled to use self-tracking technologies? Why, right? I'm not saying it's bad reasons. I'm saying I want to know why, and in that case, we can talk again about the systems of power that operate within. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I was also thinking about day-to-day monitoring of like thinking type 1 diabetes, like kind of having to monitor continually, being compelled to do so for kind of health reasons, and you're kind of already within a network of like a technology of power that has a benefit, of course. If you don't monitor, it's disastrous. But then I don't know. I was thinking about the difference between the opt-in and the compulsion.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and again, I think it's indicative of much larger cultural questions that I'm not putting that on the patients, right, or the individuals who have to do the tracking. I'm not saying like, what, you got to take insulin tracking every hour, figure out how to eat differently, right? That's not what I'm saying. But I think that it's a really, really good area to look at. Yeah, thank you for that question.
Other questions? I actually have a question for Nabil about, I'm trying to, when you set up the 3 different ways of like, that the media is depicting revenge porn, I was curious when you talked about like the gendered aspect of it and women appearing as like victims of this, if you think that there's something like problematic or untrue about that sort of gender schema, and what like benefit undermining that or changing that would be, given that like women are disproportionately like affected negatively by that.
I think to some extent this is relaying the reality. My previous study was about the revenge porn content, and I've seen that more than 80% of victims were women. So this is obviously the reality. But when for the legal definition, there is no such thing like shaming of women using sexualized content. These phrases are not in the legal definition. Then it's only about people. But media does that, phrasing, that kind of categorization, that it's only against women. There is no other problem than that it can create some kind of fear in women. And you can see in media, sexting is depicted as a very normal thing, but if you really study the practices of sexting, then you can see that women sext different ways. It's like you can compare with wearing a hijab when they don't show their face because they fear that something bad can happen if they are identified in some social context, not everywhere in the globe, but in sexting they are also covering their face, or maybe sometimes it's just a headless pic. So isn't it also about doing hijab while sexting? So that's the thing. When you repeatedly talk about female victimization, it will create some kind of fear.
Are you suggesting that the media, by framing this as like victimization of women, is creating like fear in women? Like
Yes, that's what I'm saying. But if there is only 5 incidents where males were victimized, that should also come in the later paragraphs in the news. But in my sample news, there was no such cases where the reports said that males can be also victimized in the same way, where other males are victimizing the male victims. That can also happen. When women can victimize other women, that can also happen. But it's always in the gendered binary, when the man as the offender and female as the victim. So that's the problem.
I think Adam wanted to chime in.
But it is a problem which mostly consists of men like we talk about domestic violence as a feminist issue and as an issue which affects women, like because it mostly affects women and it's mostly perpetrated by men. Why are you opposed to seemingly amplifying other elements of this discourse to where they are beyond? What's the advantage here?
So I didn't.
What's the tactical advantage of talking about men?
Yeah, that was my question. Like, why would we want to undermine that when actually women are being disproportionately victimized by this?
It's also about, it's very similar with other sexual violence, because in feminist literature, you can find that some feminists also contradict with this strategy to show women as the victim, because it can reify their subordinate position in the society. And there are different types of interpretation you can make out of it. Sometimes if you need the institutional support and legal reformation, then you have to be strategic and you have to show, like, not you have to, but maybe media does it, or people who are responsible, holding institutional positions, they do it as a strategic in a strategic way in order to make changes in the society. And I don't know why they don't talk about men, because if it was never a men's issue, then why it is coming in the academia right now these days that men are also being victimized. So it's a problem. That's why it is coming up. But the problem is, if you, I will just repeat, if you constantly talking about victimization of females, then it can create some kind of fear in them. That's it.
Did you want to add something?
Like, women or people talking about violence against women doesn't create. It might create a fear of women about being hurt, but that's because women are being hurt. It's not because the macro effect here is of violence against women. It's a misogynist violence, and when we're trying to centre men, or at least move men towards the centre in this discourse, aren't you acting to erase that?
I'm just saying, if you have the the dominant perspective in the news is victimization of women, then it is the problem, because they are reporting about a particular practice that can harass men, women, transgender, anyone. And the offenders can be anyone, the victims can be anyone. When the report is about this phenomenon, then it shouldn't be just about within this gendered frame. That's what I'm saying. But in the there are different sections in the news when it is about portraying women's problem in general, then it can be also reported as their problem. But that news is not about that was not published in the women's page, but it was published in the tech page. And then if you just repeatedly talk about this female victimization, that's my problem.
Except the fact that women are victimized by this, and the way in which they're impacted is completely different in a patriarchal system than the way that men are impacted by the same sort of images being distributed.
You keep on talking about can. That doesn't seem to be the issue, which I don't think either of us are talking about. We're talking about what does happen, and that is that the vast majority of these cases are this. And it is you must know the statistics much better than me, but it must be single figures percentage of these are cases perpetrated against men.
It's very less percentage that is happening against men so far media is concerned. But I don't know. I have presented the data, and you have the liberty to critically examine the data, and that depends on your own interpretation. And it can vary person to person, researcher to researcher. That's it. For my view, I viewed it as a problem, but maybe in your view it's not a problem. Maybe that's the thing, just a different view,
Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, this is a comment more so than a question. And just, talking about how language is powerful, right? And when we have conversations about things like violence, and when we have conversations about, content warning, things like self-harm and suicide, being able to address these issues and name them for what they are is actually something that is very empowering. And, from my perspective in my field, I can actually be able to show, some documentation based on that as well. So, it is important to frame this, I do think, from the perspective of gender, because that gives the voice to the people who are being affected by it. Which is not to say that violence does not take place against other genders. It's not an erasure. It's just, allowing to speak for the fact that, this is what's happened, that this is commonplace, right? When we talk about suicide intervention, it's actually recommended as a best practice to put it on the floor and say, are you talking about suicide? Can we make sure that this conversation is about suicide? And in the same way, I think that context applies here.
Did you have a question in the back?
Yeah. Just I would talk
Nabil.
if anyone in your research came across the phenomenon where, for instance, in the situation you're talking about,
So I can't hear
in
something going on.
situations we're talking about where other genders, that men, are talking about sexual assault, where one of the reasons that they may not come forward is because of a social misunderstanding that this is not something that happens to men. And so there's still this very particular relationship between how we understand sexual violence and how that's associated specifically with the female identity. So doesn't that in and of itself sort of suggest that this is a relationship we're talking about?
Yeah, it's also about stereotypical gender role. When men are not stereotypically expected to talk about gender or sexual harassment by women or by other men. Maybe they don't want to be in the inferior position. So it's about a stereotypical idea about gender roles. Maybe from that perspective you are right, but I'm not really here to comment on that. But I am saying that these are the major themes in these reports, and you can examine these themes from different critical perspectives. That's it.
Just about I don't know, how you relate your topic to the web and office environment.
I don't. The call for papers quite explicitly said we welcome contributions which aren't tied to the web, and I put in a contribution which wasn't tied to the web.
I actually have a question for you. Really interesting paper. I was wondering how you think that people are creating, how you think that trans women are creating communities to or what you see there and how that helps, and how you would connect that to feminized labor.
So, hi, quick plug. I have a documentary coming out on trans women communities. That's coming out August. It's about how we carve space out. One of the recent things which I'm running into is often communities end up being trans women communities end up forming themselves into quite toxic and harmful spaces, which doesn't allow the resistance. You do still get trans flats, which do resist carrying out domestic and caring labour to some extent, but you're always stuck in the same space carrying out the same labour for one another. I'm not necessarily sure this is something which we resist. Federici starts out in 75 talking about resisting domestic labour, and then if you read her writings in the 2000s, she's moving on to venerating it, seeing it as a site of revolutionary struggle, and seeing it as something to be deeply embraced. I agree with Federici. We kind of we counterplan from the kitchen, and we take domestic labour and we take what Porpentine build build through the storms of chronic pain, build in the storms of chronic pain, build out of trash. It's about taking what we have and making sure that's regarded as important and demanding that to be regarded as important. Obviously, like I said, the strike doesn't work, but taking this rather than resisting it is, I think, where I'm at.
Any other questions? Comments? Anybody else on the panel want a closing remark?
Good.
No?
No.
All right. Well, thank you to our panelists.
Gonna clap myself.
2 minutes to spare.